Hey everybody, so this week's lesson is going to be about factoring by greatest common factor. It's the first step of factoring, and over the next few weeks we're going to look at different forms of factoring and how to go about doing that. So first off, greatest common factor, this term right here, greatest common factor, is, you've probably heard of this before. It's a greatest common factor between 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever numbers is the largest number, hence the term greatest, the largest number that you can divide into 2 numbers or 3 numbers or 4 numbers, however many numbers there are. And so it's the largest number that you can divide evenly into a certain number of numbers. So, for example, say I've got these two terms right here. I've got 20x to the third y, 16x to the square, x squared y to the third. I want to find the greatest common factor between those two numbers. And so there's several ways we can go about it. Some people are really good at just looking at two numbers and figuring, oh, well, I know what that is right away, and just coming up with a number. Other people need a process. And so what I like to do is I like to go ahead and show a process on how to find the greatest common factor between two numbers. And then eventually we'll get to a point where we can just look at it and tell what it is. But I have 20x to the third y and 16x squared y to the third. And I'm going to break those down using factor trees. If I break this down, I've got 20 and x to the third y. Separate the coefficient from the variables. And then 20 we know is 4 times 5. And then 4 is 2 times 2. And over here we've got 16 x squared y to the third. And split those apart, and we got 16 x squared y to the third. And 16 is 4 times 4. And that's 2 times 2 and 2 times 2. And so to find the greatest common factor, we multiply all of the common factors together. So I look at the factor trees, and I look at just the prime numbers. So I look at the 2's, the 5's, okay? And so I look what they have in common. I have a 2 in common. I have a 2 in common. And that's everything they have in common. It's 2 2's. So my greatest common factor is going to be 2 times 2. And then look at the variables. X to the third y. Well, that's 3 x's and a y. And x squared y is 2 x's and 3 y's. And so I circle what they have in common. They have 2 x's in common. They have 1 y in common. So my greatest common factor is going to have 2 x's and a y. And then simplify that. 2 times 2 is 4. X times x is x squared and y. So the greatest common factor between those two terms is 4x squared y. Okay, so that's a long way to go about it. Again, if you just want to look at the terms, say, well, 20 and 16, well, 4 can be divided evenly into both 20 and 16, and that's the largest number that can be divided into it. And then they both have 2 x's, and they both have 1 y, and so you can get your 4x squared y. Now, let's say I've got this expression right here, 24x squared plus 32x. Now, here's where finding the greatest common factor is a issue where you need to make sure you find the greatest common factor when you factor these, because it says to completely factor the following. If you look, between 24x squared and 32x, where you think, well, you know what? If I, 2 goes into both of those, and so I can say I can put a 2 on the outside of parentheses here, take out a 2, and then divide everything by 2, and I get 12x squared plus 16x. That's true, right? 2 times 2x squared plus 16x is going to be what would be the same thing. And that's what we're talking about factoring. When we talk about factoring, what we're really talking about is we're undoing the distributive property. Okay, we're undoing the distributive property, and that's right? But it says to completely factor it. When we completely factor, that means we need to make sure we take out the greatest common factor between the terms. And so when I look at 24x squared and 32x, the largest number that I can divide into 24 and 32 is 8. And then between x squared and x, I can divide both of those by x. And now I can factor this by, again, undoing the distributive property. And 24 divided by 8 is 3, and I took out 1x. 32 divided by 8 is 4. I took out the x. And so my completely factored form is 8x times 3x plus 4. Again, I want to make sure you can always check your answer here. If I distribute this back in, 8x times 3x is 24x squared, 8x times 4 is 32x, and so I know that 8x times 3x plus 4 is my final answer. And so, again, that's the only example that I'm putting on this video today. Factoring, or factoring by greatest common factor, is pretty straightforward. If you have any questions, join me on Zoom, and I'm happy to go over some more examples with you. And go ahead and feel free to take the mastery quiz when you get a chance. Have a wonderful week.